Welcome back in. I'm Collette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. He's the author of this great book, Late Talking Children, A Symptom or a Stage, now in its second edition. And today we're going to talk about the common traits that we see amongst late talking children. We can say that the majority of them are boys. We talked about that. They're often strong-willed. And
boys and girls, strong-willed.
Okay, but if you're a late talker.
The late talkers are strong-willed. Okay. It's an equal opportunity trait.
But something you talk about is being more analytical. So can you kind of elaborate? Is that for both boys and girls?
It is. So what I mean by that is, so let's say a late talking toddler has a toy. A non-late talking toddler will actually probably like use the toy in a functional way, and they probably will engage with a parent. So for example, let's say they get a little car, they're going to roll it back and forth, they're going to move it, they're going to look at the people in it, things like that. A late talker is actually probably going to look at it. The late talker is going to look at the wheel, they're going to look how it's constructed, they're going to be really interested in kind of the details of the object in a way that's more analytical, and they're going to be taking things apart. Late talkers are also known as amazing escape artists, so they're going to figure out how to get around the child barriers and so on. A lot of them like to climb, and so they just have that orientation to the world to try to solve things and to try to analyze them in detail.
And these are characteristics and traits that we see in non-late talking children, but they're more prominent.
They occur more often in late talking children. So the notion that there's this asynchronous brain development where the visual, spatial, analytical areas of the brain are developing while the auditory and language areas are not developing as quickly creates that asynchrony. And that's why they're very interested in the details and the pieces and the function of the objects as opposed to playing with them in a social way.
Why do some people look at these traits as problematic, other than maybe the safety reasons if you're late talkers trying to...
Yeah, when they're escape artists, you want to keep them safe. But the reason is that if these traits are seen in their most extreme kind of forms, then that actually can be a symptom of other things. So, for example, children with autism will play with the toy in exactly the same way over and over again. An example I like to use is many children will line up toys, but a child with autism will line them up the same way every time, and then if you try and change them up, they'll get really upset. So that's kind of a differential that you'll have. And so if you persist in this analytical to the point where you're not learning other things and you're not learning social cues and you're not learning language, then that actually can be inhibitory or a clinical marker.
So what obstacles will they or could they face at home or at school if they have those traits?
Yeah, so when the late talking is a stage, in other words, when they're going to catch up, one of the traits is that late talking children like to, when they get interested in something, they like to work with it until they understand it or they finish it. So let's say you give them a little project in preschool. And in preschool, they're going to have like moving from one center to another based on the clock, and the child gets interested in let's say they're making something like a little house. They're going to want to finish that, but the school is going to want them to move on to the next activity, and because they're strong-willed, they're going to want to finish it. And so this can create notes home, behavior challenges, and so on, and it really just has to do with the temperament we're talking about where they're analytical. The other thing, too, is we talk about it as show and tell. So a late talker learns, all late talkers really, whether it's a symptom or a stage, they learn better by looking at something and doing it with very few words, whereas preschools are really geared to the non-late talking, where they talk to the children, they have them sit in circles, they give them verbal instructions, and that auditory modality is the weakest learning. So we call it show and tell. When you're working with a late talker, show them, let them get familiar, and then tell them. So they have a visual map. They have a visual scheme in their head you can then map the words onto.
You're talking about the challenges in, I'm going to call it a traditional classroom setting, right? So if a child, like you said, is working on something and gets upset because they just want to keep doing it.
Right.
I know there's other schools that kind of cater more to the child's play and the child-led, like Montessori-based methods. So at some point, if it's just a stage and they become catch up with their peers and are no longer considered late talking, can they transition from, let's say, a Montessori type program to a traditional classroom, or will they always struggle with being that strong-willed and wanting to keep things?
Okay, that's a really good question. So the answer is, once their language gets to the point where it's pretty functional, children can certainly transition into other kinds of schools. Having said that, if you think about in any kind of a school or even in a college situation, the people who are more technically oriented learn different than the people who are more socially humanities oriented. And I'm not saying humanities in a derogatory way here. All these things are important in our society, and different strengths and weaknesses are fantastic. Having said that, these differences will persist in their learning style. And again, even throughout their whole life, the late talker is going to want to finish something they've started. And for example, those that are in technical things, wanting to finish the architectural drawings or whatever it is beneficial. Right. But it can also be problematic when the rest of society is organized around making transitions on the clock. And so, there's these basic temperaments that once the child gets to a certain skill level, they can learn in any way. But again, we want to optimize the skill set. And again, most late talkers actually do this on their own. So as the late talker gets into middle school, high school, and college, there's less of this learning that's verbally based, it's still in listen, and more of it's turned over to them. And then late talkers then often do a lot better.
We know there's a lot of reasons for speech delays. We can think of severe intellectual disabilities, autism, hearing impairment, other serious problems. But in other cases, children seemingly normally healthy, right, just don't talk. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so actually, that's what we mean by a stage. There's really nothing clinically wrong. Now, having said that, I do want to emphasize that for all late talking children, talk to your pediatrician, be sure that they're healthy. Don't assume that. Most of the time they are. Sometimes there are clinical things. For example, you mentioned hearing loss. It's not as common as it used to be because we have universal hearing screening, but we still see late talkers that have hearing loss. And then the hearing loss is fixed, and then they do fine. They catch up pretty quickly. So we want to make sure there's no health problems that are associated. Sometimes there's things like seizures. There's other things that can happen. So don't assume everything's good. But once you get the health screening and they're fine, there's no health problems, then it's a matter of, is there other things there that are behavioral that are causing the late talking? And, things like autism, intellectual disability, and so on. But if they're late talking, you don't necessarily have to assume there's something wrong. And part of what you need in the evaluation is somebody who's thinking about that and can differentiate it.
Yeah, so who are these people that can help you pinpoint the cause or no cause?
Yeah, one of the real challenges is finding someone with that expertise. And there's a lot of different people that could do it. Because it's talking, clearly speech language pathologists are people that are educated in that. Although, like anything else, there's different skill levels. Sometimes they're really highly skilled, other times less skilled. But there's developmental pediatricians, there's special educators, there's a whole pantheon of people. And any one of those groups could do a really good differential diagnosis. And then also, maybe it doesn't go so well with any of those groups. So there's no kind of guarantees. And last time or a couple times ago, Mary talked about making an appointment ahead of time, a parents-only appointment. And I really recommend you ask the questions about, what are you looking for? Have you ever, seen a child who's late talking is a stage and not a symptom? And once they answer that kind of thing, you'll have a feel if they're open-minded about what they're seeing.
The physicians, the parent
there are
can find
physicians. There's physicians there's also a child psychiatrist, child psychologist. even as I'm spitting out these gobbledygook, right? It's like, wow, I'm a parent. How do I figure this out?
Yeah.
And so it really becomes finding someone within these professions who's willing to look at their child in an objective way and then do the detective work to figure out if it's a symptom or a stage. And if it's a symptom of what? And you have to come to the assessment with that attitude. And when you talk to somebody, it'll be pretty clear whether they're thinking about different potential causes.
Are there specific brain studies going on right now to figure out what is causing a speech delay?
There's a lot of brain studies, and many of them are really high quality. The brain is really complex, and so we can't, for example, like let's say in a stroke, you can put an image of the brain up on the light box or on the computer screen, and you can see where there's damage that's happened because of blood flow or whatever it is. We can't do that with autism. We can't do that with intellectual disability unless there really is a neurological injury or insult. So I can't like take an image of a child with autism and an image of a child who's a the late talking's a stage, I can't then give those to a doctor or physician and have them say, oh, that's the autistic brain and that's not. So we can't do the brain scans that way. There's different distributions of what we call white matter, which is the connection between the thinking cells. It's like the electrical cables. There's differences in that, but they're not consistent. So yeah, we're making progress, but we don't know those answers yet.
But do we know the part of the brain that is responsible for speech?
Generally, yeah. So we've known that for 100 years, basically because like one of the original studies, somebody was in war and they had a bullet hit their brain and then they couldn't talk, and then after that adult died, they looked at his brain and said, oh, he has a bullet went right here in his brain, which is actually in the left frontal cortex, and that's actually what gave us Broca's aphasia, which is one of the original conditions. So we know from brain injury and things what happens. The difference, though, is that like in children, they have such plasticity that they can have the same injury and they recover completely. So there are certain conditions, for example, where they actually have to remove what would normally be the speech center in the brain, and then other areas of the brain take over and they talk fine. So as an adult, you have less plasticity. There's still plasticity as an adult, it doesn't go away completely. But, an injury that I might have as an adult, if I had that same injury as a child, it would have a much different impact on my talking. So we know the general regions of the brain where things are wired. We know what centers are responsible for what activities, but there's a lot of variation. And then again, in children, damage can be compensated for. So it's amazing, really.
But if there isn't damage, most
late talking children, we don't see brain damage. You always want to rule out any brain damage, but most of the time we don't see brain damage.
So then why is speech delay? How come we can't make that correlation? Yeah. We're looking at the brain. Okay, what's different about this brain?
Right. So when late talking is a stage, again, it's this difference in terms of what's being developed in time. So an example that I use is when I'm just interacting with children, say preschool children, a lot of them, like I take them in the woods. Most of them are lost. The late talkers, not lost. They can do the visual mapping of where they are. So that's a deficit skill, late visual spatial processing in a typical kid. So the visual spatial is coming online, but the brain can't do everything at once. So it's kind of like these trade-offs that happen. And so a very plausible theory is that the late talking is really children who are developing these analytical, visual spatial skills. And while that is advanced, they're better in that than, their verbal is coming along later. And then, I'll be honest with you, as a late talker, when I see people, like I'm one of those that doesn't get lost in the woods, and when people are lost in the woods, I'm like, how come you guys are lost in the woods? But it's just this difference in development. And actually, from an evolutionary biology standpoint, it makes sense that if you're in a group, you want somebody, a navigator for your ship, and then you need someone who's going to get everybody to pull on the sails. Late talker's not usually that person. Late talkers aren't usually telemarketers, but they're going to be the navigators, And so, a society needs people with all these different abilities. So in a way, the fact that we have late talking, but since it's only about 10% of the population, it's considered unusual, even though it's really normal and natural. It's advantageous for society, but it's not as common. So then the people who learn this other way, who are always lost in the woods but talk early, they're going to see these other people and they're going to see them as different, and maybe nowadays as clinical, even though it's normal variation.
I kind of like what you're saying because it really changes the perspective, right? We're celebrating the differences,
right? As
opposed to thinking that, okay, what's wrong? My child is late talker, but it's actually, in some cases, when it's a stage, right? Something really to celebrate, because as adults, they provide.
That's really a very important insight to think long term. So initially, you're not sure if it's a symptom or a stage. Very stressful and so on. And when the child develops more, then you realize, well, it's a stage, but then maybe they're going to do something else. So like my late talking son became an air traffic controller. So he can, in his mind, see all these aircraft, where they are. He knows how to coordinate them. And a non-late talker.
That's his superpower then.
You could think of it as superpower, but I mean, that's advantageous. But then, for example, when he's in a social situation or something, he might miss a kind of an indirect social cue. So that part of it isn't as strong. So if you take somebody who's not a late talker, not visually spatial oriented, you put them in a tower, have to manage aircraft, maybe not going to go so good. You take a late talker and you have them plan a party, who's going to sit together, and kind of understanding all these social dynamics, maybe not going to go so well. And so, but together they all organize in society, and you need kind of all that together for it to work.
Oh, I think it's a nice way to look at it. I want to stick with the brains.
We've been talking a lot about brains.
In the book, you touched upon Einstein's brain, right? One of the most celebrated.
And we have his brain. It's so cool. We've got Einstein's brain.
Well, can you explain to everyone why that is relevant in this conversation?
Yeah, it's relevant because even though the brain's preserved, and Einstein, died quite some time ago now, we can go back to that brain now with modern imaging technology and say, okay, for example, I mentioned white matter, which are the cables, okay? So the cables from his area of his brain that's goes into mathematics is highly connected to his visual centers in his brain, the back of his brain. So you can imagine Einstein when he was doing, for example, relativity and thinking about movement, and he was using this example of a train leaving a station. He's actually visualizing that and connecting it to the mathematical analytical centers of his brain. But the connections from his verbal centers to that visual center and analytical center aren't as many. There aren't as many cables as in another person. And so that kind of accounts for the fact that he could imagine and do this amazing work in physics that other people couldn't do, but maybe in the talking social thing, not as much wiring there connecting that.
So we've learned a lot about his brain, right?
Yeah, we have.
And being able to compare it to the rest of society who's donated their
right, exactly,
brain. Right. Okay. The correlation between brain function and gender. Okay, we know Albert Einstein, late talker boy, right? Have we had an opportunity to dissect and look at a late talker girl's brain?
The answer is no, but we certainly have late talkers such as Julia Robertson, who's not the actress, not Julia Roberts, but she was the first, honoree in the Mathematical Society, precocious in math, and kind of a classic late talker in her temperament. And so we do have examples of female late talkers who, follow the same pattern. Again, because they're not as common, we just don't have as much imaging, and we do need to do more of that in terms of the female differences in late talking, because you'd think that would be really great because the females have the more diffuse representation of language and other things, which would be protective. On the other hand, they're able to do these analytical things, and you'd think that would be like, a combination of superpowers. But the answer is I'm speculating on that. So we don't have good studies of the brain. At Harvard, we have a brain bank. And so I think one of the things we want to think about is as we get more, so one of the problems is that we don't have great testing from Einstein or from Julia Robertson or people like that, so we don't really know what their test scores were and things like that. We kind of can base it on their accomplishments. We have diaries and so on. Now we have good testing. And so as we get a hold of those brains after people die and they're in the brain bank, we'll be able to answer that question in much more detail.
You have concrete test results.
Yeah, we do. We can link the test results. Yeah, it's really cool. Dick Woodcock, who's a really famous test maker, he was in the original IQ testing in the 1930s, and he's now 90, and they've retested him. So it's kind of cool.
How'd he do?
Yeah, right. Really well. He's super smart. He's and also just really a nice, kind person. He's really a special person. But anyway, I just think it's cool now. They've got 90 years worth of data on Dick Woodcock's intelligence, and they're getting more of that, and that's going to help us understand these nuances and developmental differences.
And you've talked about it's no secret, right, that women and men use different parts of their brain.
They do,
But how does that impact their ability to speak, and how does it impact the
so
higher
that's
ratio?
A really interesting question. So there's a common notion that's partially true that women, girls have better language than boys. Actually, boys have bigger vocabularies. We like different kinds of dinosaurs. Women can speak in longer sentences, and on average, females tend to take more conversational turns relative to males, unless they're talking about baseball or something, right? or whatever men talk about. And so the differences are really in this social communication, the nuances of social interaction, female advantage. And then in terms of grammar, making complex sentences, packing more words into a sentence, females have an advantage like that. But males actually have a bigger vocabulary because they tend to have more specialized knowledge. So it depends on how you measure language in terms of how that comes out.
So how does this apply to speech delays?
Yeah, so speech delays, we want to kind of put those into two basic categories. So one kind of speech delay is actually pronunciation. the ability to say words clearly. So instead of saying rabbit, I might say wabbit, or I might say for rabbit. And you can understand when I say wabbit, but if I say because my speech is so impaired, then you can't understand what I say. So that's a speech disorder. A language disorder, and people tend to think of those things as the same thing. A language disorder means you don't have the vocabulary, you can't put words into sentences. We also think of this social interaction as being kind of a language disorder. So maybe I'm very literal, or things like that, and that would fall into the language disorder as well. So, and then sometimes you have both. The children can't pronounce words, and then their language is delayed. I do a lot of work with Down syndrome. Down syndrome children tend to have difficulty pronouncing because of differences in their oral architecture and the coordination of their tongue and things like that. But they also tend, because they have intellectual disability on average, they also tend to have fewer words and not be as advanced in terms of what we call language. Although they're more social than average, which is really cool about Down syndrome.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I love people with Down syndrome. They're phenomenal people.
Can you talk about speech delays in families? Do they run in families?
They do, yeah. So it's really neat. The genetic studies, we have what are called pedigree studies. And so, for example, there's a family, one in Appalachia, another one in the UK, where there's like multiple generations of people with specific speech pronunciation problems, and that helps us to understand some of the genetic linkages. The genetics of speech delay and language delay and other kinds of late talking are very complicated, so I can't tell you this gene and that gene. It's much more common than that. I mean, much more complex than that. But we can say, for example, a lot of speech and language things seem to be associated with chromosome 7 and some of the genes there. Sometimes there's replications and additions, sometimes there are deletions. But some people might have those and not have speech and language delays. So it's kind of like that brain imaging thing I talked about, where there's these differences, but some people have those differences who don't have the problem. So you can't just look at a genetic scan and say, oh yeah, this person's going to have a speech delay. But there are genetic linkages, and there's no question that late talking and speech and language delays run in families. Absolutely true. We just don't quite know exactly what the genes are yet.
Well, do we know why? Do we know why they...
Well, it has to be genetically linked. We just don't know the genes yet. I mean, what I like to say is that, so Down syndrome was discovered in the 1800s, the mid-1800s, late 1800s, but we didn't know the chromosomal differences until the late 50s. And actually, it's kind of fun to go back and read what people thought caused Down syndrome. Some of it's pretty ugly, but, they didn't know the cause, and so there's a lot of speculation. That's how we are with this. Eventually, in my opinion, science is going to discover the genes in the same way that the trisomy, the replication of the chromosomes, dictated Down syndrome, but they didn't know it for a long, long time. We're kind of in that same area with autism, with speech disorder, and so on. We have some smoking guns for genes, but we just don't quite know exactly how it works.
There's been some conversation in your book about certain characteristic traits within families. So not necessarily like, in addition to family history, characteristics of like engineers.
Right, yeah.
Can you talk about that and why?
Yeah, so again, if you think about this genetic linkages and the fact that, maybe these genetic linkages are what kind of dictates the order of development from talking to problem solving and analytical skills, and there you have this asynchrony, like we might call it like Einstein did, where the analytical parts and the visual parts are more developed than the verbal parts, and that tends to run in families, and so that then ends up making people more likely to do certain kinds of professions or jobs. And so when you do surveys of late talkers, the families in general, even if they're late talking or not, tend to be in these things. And so you might say, well, you might have this advantage for analytical skills, like a lot of the precocious math people that David Lubinsky and Camilla Bembo study. They've done a longitudinal study of children that are precocious in math, and they followed them now for 30 years. And not all of them are late talking, many of them are, but they all have these certain kind of analytical traits. And then their families tend to do analytical science related things. It's interesting that music also tends to be in there as well. And music can be very technical. Clearly some musicians aren't necessarily analytical in that way, but some are. So
you even said the music really more from the mother's side, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, these are just pedigree studies. We have a lot of work to do, but right now, yes, it seems to come from the mother's side. So females are more protected against late talking. Females have a little bit of extra DNA, and also they have this diffuse representation for language. So maybe if they have this asynchrony, they're not going to be late talking, but they may be more analytical.
You answered one of my questions earlier by saying there is not yet a gene identified as a late talker.
Right. It's going to be a collection of genes.
Okay.
And it's going to be, it's going to be that they interact in ways. So it's not going to be like you have a late talking gene. It's going to be, here's a collection of genes that predispose you to late talking that may or may not express. So an example is there's a gene, for example, that causes a clotting disorder. It's called factor V Leiden. But only 25% of the people that have that gene actually ever get a clot. And so we know that gene, this is a medical example, or like type 2 diabetes, we know what genes are associated with that, but not everybody who has those genes develops type 2 diabetes. It's the same thing. It's going to be, we're going to have a collection of genes that tell us, hey, this person has a likelihood for late talking or autism or whatever it is, but they may or may not express themselves. And that part's going to be really the hard detective work. What are the triggers for different things? Yeah. Right. So.
Oh, because we want to know, right?
Well, we want discrete answers, and it doesn't quite work that way.
We know that there's a segment of children who will never talk, right? So
correct. It's rare, thankfully, but there are some late talkers who have a clinical, it's a symptom, and then they never talk. Right? Thankfully, that's rare, but it does happen.
And that is apraxia, right?
No. So apraxia, some children with apraxia, never do develop talk. So apraxia is defined as the inability to pronounce sounds when you actually can do the motor gesture. So, for example, when you're dealing with apraxia, you might walk up to a child and you say hi, and then they say hi back just automatically. And then you say to them, say hi, and then they grimace and they can't do it, right? And so it's become more synonymous with severe speech disorder of any kind. But it actually is that specific one. It actually comes from the stroke literature. So there's some people who have a stroke, and again, like even not things that aren't speech. So like you might see them scratch their head like this, and you say, okay, touch your head, and they can't do it. And that's really what apraxia is.
So involuntary motion can do it.
Right.
But when
involuntarily, unprompted, they can do it. But when you try and prompt them, they can't do it. So it's a pretty rare condition that does occur. Having said that, there's also another motor and coordination called dysarthria, and that also can be something where it's like in cerebral palsy or in ALS, they can't coordinate the muscles. Speech is complicated; it's hard to do, and so in terms of coordination, and so any kind of muscle damage like that can result in this talking not developing.
But in a young child, that could be misdiagnosed as a late talker, right? If they have that condition from a young age.
So one of the things, it can be. So like when you look at studies of apraxia or dysarthria, when you listen to how they talk when they're toddlers, you can tell, if and you look for it, because they have fewer consonants, fewer vowels. The quality of their speech is just different. And if you're trained, you can actually, you can kind of see that and predict that it might be happening. But even then, if they have apraxia or dysarthria, most of them talk. So it's actually the ones that are most severe that don't talk. Thankfully, like I said, it's pretty rare, although we do see it.
Yeah, I want to take an opportunity to have you give some words of encouragement to parents trying to find out if something's wrong, if it's just a stage or a symptom. So at this point, what do you want to say to those parents?
Yeah, so I think, what's really important, there's two things. One is that if you can, you want to set aside your worry, you want to look at your child, you want to enjoy them in the moment, you want to see them as an individual and not let panic displace just the sheer joy of a child, even if they're having challenges. There's just a lot of wonderful, joyful moments that happen in raising children, and I worry that gets taken away. The other thing I'll say is that even in children where it's a symptom and it's very difficult, we can always find a way forward. There's always something we can build on. We always want to look for the green flag. So even in the situation where it's very challenging, even in those children who don't speak, we can use augmentative systems, computer systems. There's always a way forward. And so it's important to find that way forward. And I know it's ridiculous for me as a late talker to say don't worry about it. I can honestly tell you, with my late talker, I didn't worry a lot. But my wife worried a lot. She'd wake me up at 2 o'clock in the morning. For some reason, these conversations have to happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, and she'd be worried.
Best time.
And so I understand that. But to the extent you can, set it aside, put it in a box, and look at it. The other thing I'll say today is, parents don't cause this. Every mother that I've interacted with worries that she did something wrong and that she caused the late talking. It just doesn't work that way. Mothers don't cause late talking. And again, I can't persuade you of that. You're going to think about, I fed him the wrong food. I didn't know I was pregnant. I had a glass of wine, whatever it is. That isn't causing the late talking. So please believe me on that. And don't let stress and worry overwhelm all the good things that happen with the child.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of people that need to hear that, whether you have a late talking child or not, right. Whatever you might be struggling with.
We can always build, we can always have a way forward. Always.
Next time we're going to talk about late talking children and autism. It's going to be in our next podcast.
In the meantime, we want to know what you learned today. What was the key takeaway for you? Please tell us in the comments below and help us keep this conversation going. Let us know what's on your mind. We look forward to answering any questions you leave in the comment section. Be sure to click subscribe and hit the bell so we can keep this information coming to you. And please check out the Late Talkers Foundation website, latetalkers.org. It's got lots of great resources for families.
Always remember, the best thing for your child is you.